to me, what I've always said is that, overconsumption and overproduction and overexploitation of the planet and exploitation of people and all organisms on the planet is really our problem. And so if we want to get to the heart of what's going on, we need to stop that. And that means we need to stop living the way we live. We need to.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, we can welcome back one of our favorite and most frequent guests, science communicator Kristine Mattis. For those of you who've been around long enough to hear some of the other interviews I've had with Kristine, I think you'll find that the two of us are both start out a little bit quieter than usual, but there's no less passion in what we have to talk about by the end, to be sure. So I hope you'll find tremendous heart and focus and compassion in our speaker today, Kristine Mattis. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I am your ever-present host, Dean Walker, and this is the day after Thanksgiving in 2021, a remarkable year. Just seems like extraordinary circumstances are now the norm in almost any direction we look. And I'm really pleased to be hosting Kristine Mattis here today. And Kristine Mattis is one of my heroes in terms of the science communication world. Some of you, if you watch regularly, you'll notice that a few months back I did a series on science communicators, and I called it The Good and the Bad and the Ugly. And I promise you that Kristine was in the extremely good and extremely not ugly category. And, we were just reconnecting after quite a time we haven't spoken with one another. And Kristine, it was really good to just hear how you're doing. There's so much life going on for all of us, even if we're locked down. There's just the stuff of life was there long before COVID started for most people. And it's the stuff of families and what matters most to us, and how do we make ends meet, and how do we keep our relationships intact, and on top of all the heightened concern over literally existential level concerns of at the level of government and corporations, and existential and extinction level concerns. And so that's one of the things that has most gotten my attention now for years now with you, Kristine, is that you are an extraordinary writer. You have an extraordinary ability to communicate that which I'm not even sure I've got clarified in my own experience yet. And you'll put something out and I'll see a certain clarity that resonates so well with me. And that has happened time and again with your essays. And so it's great to have you back here. I'm glad to see you. I'm planning on sharing a little bit of what my own personal life's been going on as we go along, and you're welcome to share anything that you would like to share with us about what you've been getting through in these past few months. But I know that you've come with a few things that that you've got bubbling up in your world. And so just want to say welcome. Great to have you back. Somehow we both feel quieter to me today than any other time we've met. So that's okay. It's okay. I also get a sense that it's likely we might find a little bit more energy, so to speak, by the end of the conversation, because I know that we both are on some similar wavelengths, and there's a lot going on that's really important, really carries a lot of charge for me anyway.
Yeah.
So welcome here. And
Well,
how would you like to start us out?
well, first of all, thank you so much for your kind words, as always. I mean, it's humbling. And happy Black Friday, or as some of us know, for the past, I would say 20 something, 7, 8 years, I've been calling it Buy Nothing Day. And I don't know if you know about the publication from Canada called Adbusters, but they were the ones who introduced me to Buy Nothing Day. They may have introduced it to the world. There's also the oh gosh, what's his name? The Reverend Billy and the Church of
There you go.
Don't Shop. Yeah. So this is a great way to spend the day rather than shopping. And one reason I wanted to bring that up is because I was involved in a conversation on Twitter, and probably still ongoing, about these holidays. And I've been not really celebrating holidays, or at least not in any traditional sense, for as I said, decades now, close to probably 30 years. And part of that is personal in some ways, and part of that is because of this consumerist mindset that is socially and ecologically harmful and unsustainable. And I put something out there that was kind of provocative, because I'm thinking about all these people who like to consider themselves woke, consider themselves, interested in social justice and diversity and this kind of thing, and who consider themselves climate activists, which is another thing we could talk about. I really hate that term because what we're going through is way more than climate, but they don't seem to want to confront the very things that are really the cause of it, like something like these traditions, these horrendously exploitative traditions we have of Thanksgiving. First of all, it's sort of a celebration of the white people who committed genocide on this continent. And yes, that's coming to the fore more now, but we still kind of push that aside. But we need to be grateful for what we have, and then we need to be gluttons and eat all this food. And in a time when there's so many people who don't have food, and especially since this pandemic, with so many people have fallen on harder and harder times, to keep celebrating this gluttonous exploitative holiday. And when I say exploitative, I don't mean just about Native Americans, but I mean we exploit turkeys, we exploit, the land. Everything about it is just overindulgence. And that is not something in this, it never was something we should be doing, but at this time, for people who think they're woke, we need to say we cannot continue like this. There's no reason to be doing this. Of course, there's reason to gather with your family, but not in these traditional senses, the way it is sold to us on television. And unfortunately, I'm in a position where I have to watch the evening news every night. So I see how this is sold, and how the conformity they want and they expect, and what is propagandized to us. And in a time of collapse, which we are in socially and ecologically, to pretend that this is not a part of it and something that needs to change really bothers me. And of course, Christmas as well. And I don't need to go into all the reasons Christmas is horrendous, but anybody who, has an ecological worldview can see what's problematic about Christmas.
Right. Well, I just like to pause you there for just a moment, because we could literally just stay here for a multi-part series of conversations that go right to really the center of the lie we're living and that our culture is
Yes.
based on, of infinite growth on a finite planet. Just that one, we don't need to get more complicated. We don't need, a huge number of other topics. Just that one is enough. It's clearly at the center of everything that is causing the collapse of Earth and human systems that you and I are both talking about. And yet it is the last thing that anyone in any position of power, be it government or media or corporations, it's those are the words that must never be spoken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I hear you, and it's so corrosive. It's so deadening. I think the word you and I both used when we were just checking in before recording is it's exhausting to just face that one lie at the center, and that how virtually everything about our culture impresses a message into us, usually non-verbally or unconsciously,
right,
that those words must never be spoken. Those, they shall not. And if you speak them too loud or too often, you will be rejected. You will be eliminated one way or another from the culture.
Yes, and
So
I very much feel that way throughout my life. I've been rejected by friends, family, and the culture at large. But reality is reality.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's, as you said, it's thrown at us every day, all day long. I was thinking about, I live in New York, and so one of the big traditions, I'm not in the city, I don't live in the city, but that's where my news comes from when you watch the television broadcast. And every year they bring in the big Christmas tree for Rockefeller Center. And even as a newscast, we'll discuss now some of the effects of climate change because it's happening all around us. And then they celebrate this tree. They celebrate it. It was this year, it was cut down in Maryland and towed on the highway up to New York City. I mean, and these things which are not reconcilable are broadcast as if everything is equal and everything is the same, and that these things don't conflict with each other. The bringing of this cutting down the tree in the first place. But we see this all day, every day, and it's really difficult to challenge these notions that all of us take inside. And I find that those of us who do challenge these notions are, even with the people who know what's going on oftentimes, and that's what this tweet I had and this discussion I was having with this person on Twitter was all about, is that everybody seems to want to rationalize things that they don't want to have to reconcile. We can't all be perfect and we can't all live sustainable lives in this culture, obviously, but we do need to call these things out for what they are and work toward changing them. And in decades that I've been sort of in this movement, no one wants to do that. It's very difficult because, as you said, you become marginalized. People get angry at you for bringing things up that they don't want to have to think about. But if we're really being true to ourselves and having any integrity, these are conversations we need to have. And at this point is, saying that we shouldn't be cutting down trees for Christmas, and saying that we shouldn't indulge in this consumer holiday and stop buying things, is saying that going to change the trajectory of our ecological future? I don't know that it is anymore.
Right.
But if you are an ethical and moral person, and even if you just want to try to live a life that is more whole for yourself, whole for the earth, and for others whom our lives, like you and me in the first world, our lives are being built upon their lives and the exploitation of those other people. If you want to try to deal with that, even if the trajectory we're on is doomed anyway, then we need to have these conversations, and we need to change these simple things that we can change. Like saying, you know what, I'm not going to have a Christmas tree. I'm not going to put up those lights. I mean, to me, it's unbelievable that people chop down trees and put up Christmas lights when they care about the climate. And it's more than about the climate, but those two things are directly connected to climate change. So I don't know. And like I said, it's very hard to even talk to people like this because everybody wants to rationalize these things, but we don't have time for rationalization anymore.
Yeah, no kidding. Hey, you were talking about there was a video clip you wanted us to see. Shall I set you up to be able to show that to us?
Sure. The thing that I wanted to bring up is that there's also been a lot of talk these days, lots of articles and lots of even discussion in sort of establishment and mainstream media about the depression and grief people are feeling due to climate change and due to what's going on with the environment, and children who are, fearful of their futures, and rightly so. I mean, I think one of the things lost in that, I think there are two things. I think that this is not necessarily new. I mean, I graduated from college and felt like all of this was kind of, excuse me, bullshit. Everything we do, everything I went to college for, and it was all unsustainable and mostly harmful, mostly doing harm. And so I've been feeling this way, and I know I'm not the only one, for a long time. I felt like the future was bleak. I felt like, what's it all for? What's the purpose of this? I'm just making things worse by, following this program. But now there's more and more young people who are feeling that way, more and more people who are, in college, graduating from school, because it's all right out there. It's right out there for us to see how bleak this is. However, so that's one thing, that's not the first generation who's felt this way. I think that needs to be noted. It's just more of the generation now, because it's something we can't hide from or put aside. But it's also sort of a privilege of the global North, and of the privileged classes, of the middle and upper classes in the global North, who get to feel this way. Because the poor in our own country and the poor around the world, the people that are exploited for the rest of us to live comfortably, have had this bleak future from the beginning. And of course, people of color in this country and throughout the world are the greatest majority among them. But there are, not to say there are not white folks who are in that group. But, I'll put on if I can share what Vijay Prashad had to say, and we can talk about it.
The United States, 4-5% of the world's population, still uses 25% of the world's resources. You outsource production to China, and then you say China is the carbon polluter. China's producing your buckets. China's producing your nuts and bolts. China's producing your phones. Try to produce it in your own countries and see your carbon emissions rise. You love lecturing us because you have a colonial mentality. Then there are colonial structures and institutions. You lend us money, and every time you lend us money, which is our money, every time the International Monetary Fund comes to our societies and they tell us, here's the money we are giving you. No, it's our money. You give us our money back as debt, and then you lecture us about how we should live. It's extraordinary. It's not just a colonial mentality. It's the colonial structures and institutions which reproduce themselves year after year after year. And let me tell you something, the climate justice movement, not clued enough on this, not clued enough on this. The climate justice movement is a movement that says we're worried about our future. What future? What future? Children in the African continent, in Asia, in Latin America, they don't have a future, they don't have a present. They're not worried about the future, they're worried about their present. Your slogan is, we're worried about the future. What future? That's a middle-class bourgeois Western slogan. You got to be worried about now. 2.7 billion people can't eat now, and you're telling people reduce your consumption. How does this sound to a child who hasn't eaten in days? You got to clue into this, guys. You got to clue into this. Otherwise, this movement will have no legs in the third world. No legs. Later, I'd like to tell you about the International People's Assembly, a network of 200 political organizations that we're setting up, rooted in the global South. We want to tell you what our issues are, but are you willing to listen?
So I thought that was something that was a long time coming and really needed to be said.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about the youth climate movement who are, worried about their future. It's more about the whole colonial mindset, as we were talking about. And then it actually does tie into this Buy Nothing Day and Black Friday. I mean, to me, what I've always said is that, overconsumption and overproduction and overexploitation of the planet and exploitation of people and all organisms on the planet is really our problem. And so if we want to get to the heart of what's going on, we need to stop that. And that means we need to stop living the way we live. We need to stop expecting the level of opulence we live under. That doesn't mean we can't have comfortable, wonderful lives. In fact, I think we could have much better lives. But to expect to keep going the way we're going and to keep having all of this crap that we have, not only the material things, but all of the entertainment and all these other things that we have in our lives that are totally unnecessary, and all the conveniences and all the extravagances is absurd. And I think that the holidays are part of that, the way our traditions that have been created probably, over the past 100 years or more of these holidays. They represent a lot of that. And it's even more than that. I mean, the other thing I always think is that, we shouldn't be having all these goals for our lives and wanting to have whatever kind of success financially and otherwise until everybody can meet their basic needs on this planet. And so I think when he talks about the future that these children feel robbed of in the first world, that's a future that relies on exploitation, and it's a future that no one should have when others don't have their basic needs met. And it should have always been this way. And so that brings the social justice conversation to the ecological conversation, and it's they're part and parcel with each other.
Yeah.
And it also has to do with, when we always talk about, do we want systemic change or personal change? And I always say we need both. But in our terms of our personal change, a lot of it is that we need to accept that we cannot, have goals for a life that of opulence that we expect in the first world. And we shouldn't even think it's okay for anybody to have this.
Mm-hmm.
Even like the people who are progressive members of our Congress who rail on about billionaires, they say billionaires, but they don't seem to say millionaires is a problem. And to me, it's all a problem when people are being exploited and don't have their basic needs met.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the reasons why I just love both reading your essays and whenever we get a chance to talk, because we can go through a number of layers. You know, I always tend to use the photography and the use of a telephoto lens as a way to speak about how to get different takes on a particular topic, and so we can, you know, broaden it to an extraordinary degree, or else we can focus in on a particular level of the conversation. And you know, one thing that we just touched on briefly in our check-in, and I'd like to mention it now in the same light as what you're talking about with regard to anything environmental, and that is with regard to the COVID situation. And no matter how I look at it, no matter which of the topics I'm you know, adjusting that lens to see, I see an immense amount of manipulation of of messaging, of a core narrative that we're then immersed in. We're saturated in it, and it's quite consciously manipulating the masses. You know, I had no idea. I mean, I was familiar with propaganda and manipulating the narrative back in, you know, way before 2017 when I put out my book. But I had no idea when I was writing the book, The Impossible Conversation, that I would be spending as much time as I ended up spending on how that controlling of the narrative by the people who have the ability to do that is definitely yanking us around like a chain. Like we have no idea how much we're being yanked. And why I wanted to bring it just for at least for a few moments on to the COVID conversation is this polarization that is so obviously a part of, from Bernays all the way through to now, how it's become a weaponized trillion-dollar industry of how to manipulate us in both the sales domain and the compliance with government and corporate mandate domain. I'm particularly struck right now. I don't like to use the word hopeless because hope is like long gone, but there's a way that a part of my insides are like feeling corroded by the shredding of the sense of community, the sense of any sort of interconnectedness, interbeing, if I want to get all Buddhist about it, at any community level. There, sure, there's the occasional pocket, but you know, it's extraordinary how we've been just blown out to an extraordinary level of disconnection with one another. And you know, you mentioned again before when we were checking in about how much manipulation is going on through things like the vaccination process, the corporate involvement and pressure to make that the only answer, and on. The levels of manipulation of the masses in this is hard to overstate. But what I'm noticing, and I have been noticing all the way through the COVID time, it gave me even more time to do the research that I continue to do. And that is this kind of what's sometimes called mass formation. There's a Belgian therapist who's getting a lot of airtime about that. But the mass hypnosis that we're in was well in place, deeply in place, and taking us down the road to, you know, the far end of the spectrum, which is near-term human extinction on this spectrum of being collapse aware. I feel like what's corroding inside of me is that we're locked in about how it's about COVID before anything else. And what I'm seeing is that it's just layer upon layer of further and further divisiveness. And with that, divide and conquer is right at the center of any of those propaganda methodologies. So I just wanted to mention that because, I really got this hit. And it was back a ways. It was back when Greta Thunberg first showed up, I believe it was in Poland at that COP. And I saw her and I heard what she had to say, and she moved me to tears. Her courage and her incredible clarity and so on. But then almost the next moment, the insight that I got was she is just going to be eaten alive. She's going to be normalized into more pablum of blah, blah, blah. That, this year, of course, blah, blah, blah was her kind of byline. But the way that this system is now so masterful at grinding up anything unique, anything that has the slightest possibility of making a difference, of shifting consciousness or opening our eyes collectively a little bit, it just gets consumed. It gets ground up into fine powder and we move on. So I hope there's a point in there that has sparked you in some way. I just want to speak to some of the core elements that have been there longer than COVID. And sure, they've gotten like off the charts bigger in COVID, and we can go there as much as you'd like. But I wanted to talk about just those elements, those core elements have been consciously crafted and in place for a long time prior to COVID. So does any of that spark anything? And we can go in any direction you might like.
Sure. What it makes me think of is, first of all, I think that people are, I don't want to paint a broad brush, but I think people are fairly naive about power and about how corrupt and corrosive and manipulative the powerful are in our society. And again, I don't want to disparage people, but honestly, I don't want to say cynical because I think I'm realistic, but I'm very distrusting of the powerful. And even in that distrust, they seem to go beyond what I can comprehend in terms of how psychopathic they are. And I really think most people in power are psychopathic when it comes down to it. You get to that point where you really believe your lies because if they weren't born that way and became powerful because of that, I think they often turn into that when they have power. But I think that is the core of one of our problems, is that power and marketing are really what is creating our predicament and what's going on. And so I think that's where our battle is. And I think instead the powerful are manipulating us to battle each other. And that goes for COVID, and that goes for everything really in our society. And so the way out is really to find more common ground. And it's very hard because a lot of us are struggling in life in all sorts of different ways. And so when you already have all these struggles and stresses, it's so much easier to sort of be ignited, and that stress will come out with vitriol or with anger or with defensive-ness. I mean, it happens to me too, and it's happening more so now than usually. But we have to go back and try to, take a breath and realize your neighbors who you might disagree with, and I disagree with most people in society, I think, because I don't really live, and haven't for most of my adult life lived like a sort of normal person, as normal as I may look on the outside. But I know that people are just living the life they were told to live. And I often challenge people on that, but the people who are, holding the marionette strings and who are controlling us are these people in power who get so much profit off of us, who financially and in every other way. And right now, what's happening is this shock doctrine moment, as Naomi Klein wrote. They are taking this COVID pandemic and they are manipulating it to push all of these agendas that they had in place. And it's interesting because this came out and it's deemed a conspiracy theory, and the fact checkers were saying, because we found out that they had all these trials and ideas about potential future pandemics, and the people are saying that doesn't mean, the fact checkers are saying that doesn't mean that the powers that be created this pandemic. Well, who's saying they created it? What we're saying is they're using it for their personal gain and for the agendas they had set, which are all economic agendas and all agendas to enhance their power, enhance the profits of the people at the top. And that's exactly what's happening. The billionaires became even hugely more billionaires. The inequality grew more than ever, and as it's been going on for the past 40 years. It's very clear that there's the marketing and the manipulation is it's been everything in our lives for probably most of my entire life on this planet.
Yeah.
And we are really being propagandized and brainwashed, and a lot of that is to create divides within our communities, within our citizenry, rather than to have us all unite in ways we could unite to fight the powerful who are really oppressing all of us when it comes down to it.
Yeah.
And I think one way of getting out of that is to not have aspirations to be one of those powerful, because more and more we see these people that we thought were progressive or who proclaim to be progressive. And I hate that word progressive. I don't trust anybody who calls himself progressive, honestly. But this is a term that a lot of people use, and we're seeing that they seem to want to speak for the people and work for the people, but then they get caught up in the same egotism and the same quest for power, and enjoy that power, and nothing happens for the rest of the world and the rest of the people. So that's what I see happening. And as far as Greta, I wanted to comment on that too, because I can't help, I know Greta herself is someone who clearly has concerns and cares and feels passionate about the ecological collapse or the climate movement. But I can't help but see her as not only someone who's being manipulated and used, but I think that was there from the beginning, because I can't understand how this young woman, this young girl at the time, now she's, technically an adult, was brought to the forefront of climate change and given this voice. It didn't just happen by accident. Things like that don't happen by accident. Granted, she had famous parents, at least from where she is, but she's being used as a tool, and I'm not sure that she knows it, but it had to begin. There were camera crews the first day she set out on her climate strike, and that didn't just happen for a reason. There's someone knew about it, someone thought that this could be a story, and then all of a sudden this child who's spoken many of the things that a lot of people have said for decades, but the people who said them were never heard. Now she's able to be given this forum to say these things, and she's speaking at world conferences. And I think there's a reason for that. I think the words coming from a child who hasn't yet been a part of sort of the adult world and the career-driven world, the world where you need to find a livelihood and find a way to get by. I think that makes it easier for people to hear and sort of dismiss, or just, I'm not sure how people internalize it and reconcile it with themselves, what they're hearing from Greta. But I know that all of the adults who have said the same things as she said for decades, starting from, say, the hippies in the 60s to Gen X, who were, tree sitting and doing things like that in the 90s, those voices who said the same thing Greta was saying were never listened to. So we have to think about why that is. And it's not by accident, and it's not just some weird coincidence and some great thing that happened and that she was given a forum. There's a reason for that.
Yeah. Well, I'm open to hearing what you're saying. My experience was that Stuart Scott, from what became Facing Future before his death last year, he was really instrumental in bringing her into the public spotlight at that COP in Poland. And I don't know. I know that Stuart was a man of immense integrity. He was not a sellout to anybody, period. Just I can say that with my life at stake. But I don't know. I don't know what other elements are at play. I don't know. But even if all of that is true, where I think both you and I end up is a bit discouraged about where we're headed. I don't think that between the two of us we can come up with even a couple of really positive pieces to add to this so that we can come out of it happy and hopeful and so on. I just doubt it.
Yeah.
So what I propose is that we just shift gears a little bit from the kind of sober place that I believe we're both in, from our current circumstances and our own life history and the knowledge and to some degree wisdom that we might carry, is if indeed what we're looking at offers nothing in the traditional realm of hope, and possibly nothing at the larger levels, the global, the national, the political, the corporate, each of those layers just look impenetrable to me. So what I challenge us both to do, if it's okay with you, I'd like to just shift gears for the last few minutes that we get to be together today. I'd like to ask us a couple of questions and explore a little bit, and ask the people who are watching this recording to also join us, perhaps in the show notes or in a later time we can get together and perhaps do some live stuff if you'd like. I'd like to explore two questions. And so the first question really comes straight out of the body of work that I've been creating since writing the book. I needed something to support the research that I did that validated these existential global level predicaments that we've created. And so I really decided to gather as many practices and skill sets as I could find for people to participate in circle together with one another. And your practices are likely going to be different than mine, but we can both sit in circle together and we can both hold space for each other to build the kind of capacity that we will need to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors. This is a self-regulation and a co-regulation issue as far as I can see from here out. If we don't have those expanded capacities to self-regulate, to co-regulate, in other words, to bring ourselves back to a sense of center, a felt sense of meaning and relatedness and belonging, if we don't have an expanded sense of that capacity, those skills that bring us back, when we're knocked off center, then truly it is hopeless, hopeless in every conceivable definition of the word. So what I'm asking here is if you and I could start to, just put on our designer cap and just imagine, if you will, how would we answer the question, what skills and practices and capacities does a sincere person need in these times? What are some of the skills and practices and capacities that we need to be functional, to be able to get out of bed every morning and say, how can I serve the people I love and the things that I love in this life? And I won't be able to even ask that question if I haven't expanded my capacity to be that. It takes work. That much I do know. I've had, my entire life, since I was in my early teens, I got some really good coaching to put together some practices to be more functional in the world, to be more present in the world. I'm deeply thankful for that coaching. And I've grown that set of practices for my whole life. I'm curious if anything comes up for you that lives at any level. Like, what do you do with you and your spouse, and you and your friends, your workmates? How do you self-regulate? How do you get yourself back to center? How do you stay sane in these crazy times? So anything come to mind?
I'm not sure that I am sane in these crazy times. I have a hard time doing it myself, but
Yeah.
I think what I often try to do, if I can, first of all, is try to have empathy. And it's not always easy, but always remember that everyone around you is going through something, and we all have perspectives based upon what we've gone through and what our lives are now and what they have been. And so that's one thing, is to try to always think about having empathy. It's not always easy, but another thing is to take a step back, like when you're angry and heated. And I can say that I don't always do that. And it's very hard to do the more stress you're under. So I know that when I'm under tremendous amounts of stress, I can explode. When I'm not under stress, it's much easier to take a step back and think about things. But those are the kinds of skills and capacities that I try to sort of foster in myself as much as I can when I can. And if I don't do those things, I try to remember that instance and think about, doing better in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about right now.
Great. I appreciate it. Thanks. And there's a huge amount in what you've already said, kind of pointing in the direction of things like a contemplative practice. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere these days and has been for quite some time, kind of like yoga a few years ago. The meditation community in this world, whether it's somebody who does it once every 3 months, whether they need it or not, or they actually have a daily practice and so on. That's a extraordinarily important cornerstone, I would say, that people have at least a basic contemplative practice to be able to find stillness, to know what it is to see their inner dynamics, that when thoughts go like a little chipmunk on the wheel, we need these basic level skills that in my own work in living resilience, the kind of the entry level I call first aid level self-regulation, or first aid level co-regulation. These are the kind of skills that are actually people who bring those skills into like disaster relief efforts, like let's just say Hurricane Harvey down in Houston. An entire region in Texas is just obliterated by the the most severe rain that they've ever experienced, ever. And so you're sleeping in a high school gym with 50 other families, and everybody's wondering, what the hell are we going to do now? You know, our house is completely swamped. You know, our community is just exploded by this event. And there are, again, people who come in as a part of the team at every level to do what they can to support, you know, to help out. And these are skills at the first aid level of resilience skills or self and co-regulation. These are skills that an 8-year-old can sit down for 10 minutes of easy kind of lessons and try it out. And they can then take those same lessons over to the corner of the gym where their family is and teach the rest of their family a few skills that will help each person relocate into their body. Because so many times, you know, when something really stressful hits us, knocks us off center, we're not going to be present in our body. Things are not going to be normal in here like what you're used to. So there's that. And I appreciate your response. So here's the other question. It's kind of similar, but just on a slightly larger level. What, in an ideal neighborhood where we have a little time to learn some of these skills, practice some of them in our own household, and we might have a little extra time to be able to reach out, meet our neighbors. I don't know about you, but I barely know my neighbors. And I don't know people two doors down in my little neighborhood. So in this imaginary neighborhood, in this imaginary future in which we have, each of us has a little bit of time, a little bit of space to be able to reach out, what would be helpful resources to have in this imaginary neighborhood? Let me give you a super basic example from our area. We have a thing called CERT. See if I can remember what it stands for. Community Emergency Response Team. Mm-hmm. And then so that the fire station, let's say every 3 months or so, they'll have another round of 6 weeks of classes, and everybody goes in with their little workbook, and they find out, we can find out who lives on our block. And we can find out who has special needs. So if all the electricity went out, who would need help? You know, like, and do they maybe need to get a generator if they absolutely can't have their refrigerator go out because their medicine is in it, and so on and so on and so on. And those CERT classes are, for most of the people who go through them, they're the first time that they've met many of their neighbors. Yeah. First time that they've ever thought of what would happen if there were no electricity for 2 days, 3 days or more, and so on. And so it just extraordinarily important relationship inviting, communication and connection inviting, rather than this polarization you and I have been talking about quite accurately. These, at a most basic level, this kind of CERT training might be a good thing. Is that available where you live? You know, the person who's watching this podcast right now. And so I'm curious. I've been involved with a few conversations about beyond that kind of CERT level training. What are some other things that might be good to have in a neighborhood? One answer that I thought was kind of interesting recently, the person said, there should be something like a very basic store, a very basic place where where the folks who are in this little community, little pocket, know that there are some extra food resources. And it's managed, and people know about it and contribute to it and manage it, and take care of the rotation of the stock and so on. No, I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. And I hadn't thought of it in quite that way, where it could be something that is like a little co-op.
Mm.
So it was just one idea. Another idea that I've heard is also a resource or reference library. Now, of course, we've all got the internet, and that's got more, information than any human being ever has needed in human history. But what about when the electricity goes out?
Yeah.
So those are
Yeah.
two ideas. I'm curious, does that spark you at all? Either one of those,
Well,
more on the personal self-regulation, co-regulation side or practices side, or what about this imaginary community, a little pocket who just decide, how could we support ourselves? How could we, yeah.
it makes me think about a couple things. The first one, going back to self-regulation, I want to mention this because I may have said this before on your podcast, but I think one of the best things we can do is take a breath. And that's not just figuratively, but literally.
Right.
I kind of figured that out as a teacher. And at one point in my life, I was teaching a child with special needs who had Down syndrome. And so at times he could get really riled up about things. And so I'd say, okay, stop. And we'd both take a deep breath. And that was kind of instinctual to me. But since then, I've taken it everywhere. And actually, before then, I remember in college, my roommates used to make fun of me because I was a sigher. I sighed all the time. I wasn't even conscious about it, but I think it was my way of regulating myself, not even knowing it at the time. And so that was pretty funny that I realized, well, that was probably good. And I probably needed those sighs. But that's one thing about the self-regulation. As far as community, when you brought up those specific things, I think the biggest thing, I don't know if we need a sort of a library or a little store if we could get those communities back and know our neighbors again. And I have to say, I grew up in a condominium complex. I think in that place where I grew up, there were like 300 condominiums, and it was quite a community. I lived in a place where like walking to town and walking to stores wasn't all that easy. It wasn't a rural area, but it's an area where driving is sort of required. And I'm back in nearby that area now. But in that condominium complex, we knew all of our neighbors, not all 300, but if you didn't know that person, someone you knew that person and everything. And the kids all played together. It was a place you let your kids out in the morning because someone was there to sort of parents didn't really oversee all his kids, but you can trust that other parents would be there to watch, other kids and things like that. And we even had sort of like a community watch, unofficial community watch. So if people came in from outside the condominium and were causing any kind of trouble, there'd be adults there to kind of look after what's going on and protect the children, and that sort of thing. And the funny thing is, after 30 years of being gone from this area where I grew up, I'm back in the general vicinity and I'm back in a condominium complex. And as I see it now, I think the majority, or probably at least half of the people in this much, much smaller complex are senior citizens. And so they grew up like me in a different kind of way, in a different kind of community where you did know your neighbors. And I've gotten to know more of them just from walking around in this complex and taking walks than I have known anybody in my whole adult life in the various neighborhoods where I've lived, and I've lived in many places. Just by being outside and seeing other people outside and, waving to them or in their cars or saying hi and just being neighborly, and then you get to talking. And I know that I have a lot of differences between a lot of the people here, whether it's politically or whatever, and different worldviews. But I think we all seem to get along quite well. And I think that's because when you meet people face to face and you talk to them, their political alignment doesn't really matter that much. And you can talk to them on other levels. And even if, I can't talk to anybody here about how I feel about the holidays. They say Happy Thanksgiving to me, and I say, Happy Thanksgiving, and they'll talk about their family coming over and the big turkey dinner. And I can't really say that, no, we don't celebrate. We'll have a nice, basically what I said is, my family will have a nice, delicious small meal and, just have a small little thing together, and that's fine. But I think even though we don't have to agree on all these things, there's a trust there, and there's just a friendliness and a neighborliness. And then by that same token, I could go to one of these neighbors and ask them for a book, or ask them, like people used to do you have some sugar? Do you have some flour? Sure. This kind of thing that used to go on, and that we don't feel comfortable doing anymore. But it's sort of like taken back in time, where I feel like I could probably do that. And in fact, the next door neighbor and our household, we do that all the time. So I think that is the biggest thing, is to get to know people. And when we're talking about this divisiveness, it really diffuses a lot of the divisiveness when you get to know people, or at least just talk to them and be friendly to them, because it's so much easier to get in fights with strangers on the internet, or get angry at people that, the neighbor down there that you haven't even learned their name and you don't know anything about them. But when you talk to them, and even if they're of the opposite political persuasion and social, beliefs and everything than you, they are a person to you then. And I think it can change everything, and you can find common ground.
Well, I'll tell you what, unfortunately, I can see that our time for today's conversation is drawing to a close, and I've so appreciated it. And I really didn't know we would get to this particular spot. So I would like to invite you back. No pressure, don't answer yet. But I would like to invite you back as soon as you're willing, for us to have part B of this conversation, in which we talk about what are some of the advanced self-regulation and co-regulation skills. What are some of the advanced resilience skills that we can imagine putting together in our own homes, in our own neighborhoods, kind of in the next chapter of this imaginary pocket of community that you and I are both talking about, so that we really could be expanding our capacity, both individually and collectively in our little pockets, to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors. Because I don't know about you, but I don't get that the stress level is going to go down anytime soon. I don't have a good feeling about that. So there's the invitation, is that you and I get together, have the next level of this conversation, talk about some of the possible, more, take a bit more work, a bit more effort to actually do the practices, to expand those capacities. I think I'd really love to have that conversation with you, because it sounds like you're already kind of planting the seeds where you're living for a bit more connection, a bit more relationship. And so maybe both of us have some possibilities of growing this kind of little informal network or little community group. It's just an idea.
A good one.
Okay. So give it some thought. That's, if I could say that there's one thing that my work is about these days, is about this, that kind of that buzz phrase of how on earth could we expand our capacity to be present in a world that has nothing else on its mind but to come in and predatorily take out our attention and to shift and manipulate our behavior with one another. This is definitely the neighborhood I'm trucking in a lot, and I'd love to have your ideas and thoughts and explorations. So keep it in mind. There's the invitation.
Thank you. Sounds good.
Is there anything you'd like to kind of wind up with today as you are looking out? You know, you and I connect on Twitter fairly often, and that's one way to stay with a particular pulse of what's going on. Is there anything that you'd like to just mention as something that's kind of got your attention, something that you're a little bit concerned about, or something that's been inspiring to you that you've recently heard or connected with that you'd like to just kind of leave as we finish up?
Well, I don't want to, I'm sorry to say I haven't seen it or heard anything that's been inspiring to me.
Yeah.
It's been a time when I'm feeling rather hopeless for a number of reasons. But the one thing I would like to say is, and it's for myself as well, is that I'm really seeing, as you said, a massive manipulation and control of our global populace going on. And I think people aren't recognizing what's happening under these circumstances. And it's very sad to see the divisiveness in communities of people that I didn't think would be that way and are becoming that way because of COVID and because of what we've been going through for the past couple of years. And I hope we can all focus ourselves to remember that there are really rich, powerful, wealthy people around the world, in our country and elsewhere, who are exploiting us basically, and they are creating this between us. And so we really have to try to resist it. And if we don't resist it, we're going down a really scary path. That's what I'm really seeing now, more than the ecological collapse that will likely take us, because we're not really confronting it in any valid way, shape, or form. But I think there's a totalitarianism that's emergent everywhere, and people aren't really either recognizing it or they are okay with it, and it's really frightening me.
Yeah.
And I hope we can see that and then realize that we need to unite even amongst our differences. And that's something that I hope for myself too, because, you know, I can get as divisive and as angry and as tired of hearing things and as annoyed as the next person. But I do know who the enemy is, and I'm going to try my best not to make enemies of the people that I should not be making enemies with. Because we really all need to be together, and we really need to watch out that we're going down a road in which this world may turn into something that we never expected it to be, and that none of us, almost all of us, never were born into.
Yeah. I really appreciate you saying that and leaving us with that. I couldn't agree more. It's one of the few ways of discerning that the lens through which I can view the things that I see every day is, does this bring me closer with the people in my neighborhood or not? Or does it further divide us? And that's a critically important piece. I so appreciate you bringing that. And perhaps that's where we could start next time, assuming we do, looking at how we can expand our capacity to be present with each other in the face of larger and larger stressors. And Kristine Mattis, thank you for bringing yourself in the midst of what are challenging times for you. Always a joy to have you here. And I look forward to whenever it is we get a chance to be together again.
Me too. It's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for giving me a voice for whoever might want to hear it.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.